Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. This week's video is an excerpt from one of my Patreon exclusive videos. This is from the third episode in the portrait series where we are sculpting a skull to begin with. If you want to support the channel and watch the full video, head over to patreon.com/Eirik Arnesen. You'll find the link in the description below. Enjoy the video. Today's episode is going to be focused on getting things ready for surface finish, which means we must get all the information we see on the surface represented in clay accurately. We are going to be working on improving some of the information already present and adding more specific information around areas like the side of the skull and the teeth. Let's get to it. One of the things I mentioned at the end of last episode was the outline of the skull from the front. Just like from the profile view, this outline or contour needs to be accurate. The first issue is placing said contour in depth, which we did last time. In general, the widest point of the skull from the front view runs right behind the ear, so that's the depth that I'm placing it at. Misplacing any contour will lead to issues with turning the form later down the line. If we place the contour of the skull from the front view too far back, then the turn from this widest point to the back of the skull is going to happen too fast, and the back of the head will look very square. Too far forward and it will look too round. Placement of any contour in space is very important to the success of a sculpture. If you misplace the contour, you might end up with difficulty in turning the form convincingly, or turning the form in a way that well represents your subject at least. I'm making a lot of small changes to the already established information here early on. I'm adding more specificity to them, and there's a reason I start off with that rather than starting off with introducing new information like the teeth. After a break from working, your eyes are fresh, and your ability to see major flaws is much stronger. I try to consider this while sculpting and always attack what I think is going to be the most productive thing to go after. Early in the session, with a fresh eye and a lot of energy, I prefer to go after more minuscule changes in already established information. Information that perhaps looked really good when I last left the sculpture, but now have become eyesores. It's tough to explain exactly why this happens to us, why we can see more clearly after leaving a sculpture alone for a while. I guess it might have something to do with not being used to seeing the work or something like that. Whatever it might be, it works, so we're going to take advantage of it. Information that I'm adjusting is around the eye sockets, the jawline, the cheekbones. Any area that was previously pretty close needs small adjustments to it to make it more specific to my subject. We'll come back to the topic of specificity later on because it's a big one. Sculptures that look generalized will never have the individuality or life of a sculpture that has specificity. How do we get specificity? We need something to attain the specificity from, and in my case, we have a plaster skull of a real person. Because it's a casting from a real skull, all the real-life information is going to be there, even if the years of abuse the skull has taken has dulled some of this information a little bit. This information, specific to life and specific to one individual, is the great secret, I think, of creating work that look and feel alive, or perhaps elevated, if you will. This is why work that comes from someone's imagination and knowledge of anatomy will often enough lack something. It tends to look somewhat generalized because the anatomy books rarely have images of individuals in them. Now there is some exceptions to this of course, but in general, the anatomy books will have pictures of diagrams. These are important to know, and to a certain extent, they do set you free The more you know anatomy, the more you'll be set free when sculpting. But be careful and remember that having specific reference to work from almost always lends itself to a better result. This does of course mean that we must attempt to attain accuracy in our work for said specificity to even matter. If you have a model and you don't use them or disregard what they bring to the table that's unique to them, then it's all for naught. So here I'm trying hard to pay close attention to the small details that makes this skull unique. Up till this point, paying attention to such details slow us down or bog us down more than they benefit us, because we weren't there yet. But now, at this stage, it's time to go after a lot of these details in order to capture the specific nature of our plaster skull. The jawline is not a straight line, for example. It has movement to it, and that movement happens in a specific place, specific places. Each bump along the edge of the jaw has a certain size in relationship to the other bumps present on the edge of the jaw. And these must all function well together, and we must observe carefully each one so we know their nature and how they operate as a unit, so that we can create the edge of the jaw specific to this skull. Giving or assigning some sort of abstract name or value to each individual part that makes up the edge of the jaw can be useful. A value that I would assign while working on something like the jawline would be length, for example. Sometimes the value I would assign would be an actual light or shadow value. Sometimes the abstract value can be an object. One that I like to use to describe the trapezius muscle and how it travels from the shoulder to the back of the neck is a twisted ribbon or a piece of paper that's been twisted, turned 90 degrees to its original orientation on one side. One I like to use for the serratus muscles and the ribcage is describing the serratus muscles as fingers grabbing onto the outside of the ribcage from the back. One I like for the belly and its relationship to the ribcage is the ocean, the ribcage being a wave crashing down on the abdomen, the belly. It doesn't really matter what abstract value you assign. It's more about forcing yourself to look at things deeper than what they look like. Looking for how something actually functions. Abstract names or concepts can help you find the individual character of a specific section of the body, and it will help you to sculpt it too. One thing I'm doing a lot of here is adding clay to turn form. It happens slowly, but around the skull it might be a little bit more apparent because it's happening a little bit more aggressively. I'm adding volume to turn the form, going from contour to an actual form that turns, connecting one contour to the next essentially. This begins to shift the conversation I'm having with myself about this skull forwards towards completion. This is of course the only way to proceed the sculpture forward, but there are some dangers here to watch out for. Only once I begin to feel confident in my contour am I willing to begin turning it towards the other contours. Only when I feel confident am I going to be adding volume to the spaces between the contours. In order for this sculpture, or any of my sculptures for that matter, to read somewhat like the subject I'm attempting to sculpt early on, I try to follow behind my contour with volume. I'm anticipating the amount of volume that I will need. So I'm essentially turning the form underneath the surface a little bit, if you will. This sets up the eventual turn I'm going to make, the eventual volume I'm going to add, without sacrificing the flexibility of having the contour stand proud of the surface. If I can help it, I'd like all my issues with drawing the forms, for example, to happen underneath the surface. And if I time things right, once my contour reaches its overall width, I'll have made it accurately. Once that happens, I will have had enough time and effort put into the drawing of the forms that fill the spaces in between the contours. These will be accurate, or more than accurate enough to proceed at least. Now I can push forward and add volume between the contours, and when I'm doing this, I'll follow the forms that I drew and represented in clay as well. So the volume is not added in random fashion, it's added where it will eventually need to be, on the forms that exist between the contours. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for next week. If you want to support the channel, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below the video to learn how. Until then, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.